What's up, everybody? This is Erin from Erin's Audio Corner, and today we are going to be taking a look at the Kef R2c Kef center channel. It is a center channel that has a 5-inch mid-range with the 1-inch dome tweeter coaxially located in the mid-range, and then it has a pair of 5¼ inch woofers on either side. I'll throw up a picture right here so you can check it out. The unit that I got actually came from a viewer who sent this to me, as well as the R8A, which is the Atmos speaker. I've tested that. That will be coming shortly. And let me go ahead and address up front. I've already had a few people ask about how this R2c compares to the Kef R3, which I tested a few months ago. I will do a follow-up video doing a comparison, probably within like the next couple days, hopefully, or no later than a week, probably. And I will address those aspects in that video because I don't want to drag this down too much further than it needs to be dragged down. With that said, I'm going to start off with talking about the subjective evaluation. So what I did for this speaker, because it's just one, is I treated it like a standard center channel. I put it on a stand a few feet out from the wall of my living room. And my living room is a large open floor plan living room, so it's a lot of space to fill. And that naturally creeps into, you're talking about bass response. So one thing that I noticed that was lacking on these speakers was bass. They tend to roll off at around 100 hertz. I've got the data on that. We'll check that out soon. The other thing that I noticed about these speakers that stood out to me in an unfortunate way was sibilance. They were very sibilant. And, I've listened to a lot of my tracks over and over and over again. Naturally, I thought maybe I'm just hearing things. So I actually got a graphic equalizer. It's a 31 band graphic equalizer. And I went to the 5 to 8 kilohertz region and I started kind of playing around with that. What I found was that knocking down 8 kilohertz by about 2.5 dB got rid of the sibilance. Maybe not got rid of it, but certainly calmed it down enough to where it was livable, because in my subjective opinion, it was intolerable in its bare form. Another thing that is also worth noting is kind of going back to the subjective aspect about the bass. When I was listening to Nas's new album, which if you haven't heard it and you like rap music, I say give that a shot. You might really enjoy it. When I was listening to that, there's a lot of lower bass content, and I was listening to it with a Parasound Hint 6. I'll throw a picture of that here. And that's a pretty beefy integrated amplifier, and even with that amplifier being able to handle a 4-ohm load with no problem, the lights in my living room actually were dimming. This house was built about 7 years ago. It's not an old construction home, it's a new construction. And all I had playing was just that center channel. What that tells me is that the impedance of the speaker dips down pretty low. And sure enough, when we go and look at the data, we see that as well. Another thing that I noticed was that the sound of singers, and I think mostly, or maybe not mostly, but more predominantly, well, I noticed that with female singers. And when I did some investigation there, I found that it was usually around the 2 to 2.5 kilohertz region. Based on my experience, that's kind of where I figured it was going to be. So that's where I targeted the EQ, and dropping that down like a dB or so kind of got rid of that. Otherwise, I would say that the speaker is pretty neutral, certainly through the mid-range. The high frequency does have a bit of a bump to it, which I also noticed with the Kef R3 that I tested. And that makes me think that maybe this is a sound signature that Kef is going for with this particular coaxial drive unit. Now, I will also say that I have seen spinorama data of some of their other speakers, and it only seems like the R series speakers are the ones that do that. And I do find it interesting. So if anybody out there from Kef is happening to watch this, if you maybe reach out to me and let me know what you think, or maybe even leave a comment in the comments below and let me know what you think about my assessment. I would be curious to know if I'm on the right track here or not. Getting back to the comparison with the R3, people also ask, what about using this speaker as an LCR? And again, I'll save a lot of the details for later, but if you vertically orient this speaker, it takes the woofers and it puts it above and below. And you can certainly get away with doing that. Absolutely, you are going to need a subwoofer for the speaker. There is zero doubt in my mind about it. You cannot get by using this speaker without subwoofer. So even if you just use it as a center channel, or you decide to go LCR with it stacked vertically, you're still going to need a subwoofer either way. Let's talk about the soundstage cues. Now, soundstage of Kef speakers have always stricken me in a positive manner in regards to the soundstage depth. They've just always done a really great job of layering the soundstage and not giving away the speaker location. Now, pretty much any decent speaker will do the job of not giving away the speaker location. But I will say to date, maybe other than the exception of like a handful of speakers, which I can't even think of right now, I'm just giving myself a buffer. The coaxial design speakers do a much better job of having a more 3D sense of soundstage layering. And to this point, I honestly can't tell you why. I don't know, in relation to the data, I don't know if that is simply due to the timing or if it's more attributed to the vertical directivity cohesiveness between the tweeter and the mid-range, as opposed to having a tweeter above, a mid-range below. It could be a combination of both of those, but it is something that I continually notice when I listen to a good coaxial speaker. Additionally, like the Kef R3, the soundstage of the speaker isn't very wide, and I prefer, generally speaking, a more wide radiation pattern. This speaker is a more narrow radiation pattern. In regards to home theater purposes, it's actually a good speaker. You can listen off axis and you still maintain the intelligibility of speech pretty good within the typical region of about plus or minus 30 degrees to the side of the speaker. But when you go beyond that, then you start running into the off axis response dipping a good bit in the mid range area. And that's going to cause some concern with dialogue. And it's interesting to note, we'll touch on this when we get to the data, that the slopes of this speaker on the crossover region are shallow, or what I would consider shallow. And I'm kind of curious. I feel like maybe it's a money saving method there, but I feel like if they were steeper slopes, they probably could have gotten away with a more neutral response off axis. But with the center to center spacing of the mid woofers on either side of the mid range coaxial unit, you're still going to run into some issues there. That said, again, for home theater purposes, this is fine. You can use it. It's probably one of the better center channels that's out there. And I say that not having tested many center channels at all. I really say that because it's a coaxial design, and a good coaxial design allows you a more point source soundstage or more point source speaker. I'll put it that way. Meaning that as you drift further and further off axis, you don't get as significant of response anomalies as you do with standard MTM type designs, or a tweeter located maybe above a mid woofer or something like that. I've seen some kind of oddball center designs, and this to me, if I got to be honest, is probably more close to what I would consider probably a perfect, quote unquote, a perfect center channel. But it does still have its issues. Obviously, like I said, the output limitations on the low end, and then the sensitivity is rather low. So you're going to need a strong amplifier to drive it. But using the right crossover point, at least 80 hertz, I would probably even say 100 hertz or above, it'll be a fine speaker for most listeners. And in that regard, it got to about 95 dB, I believe, at my listening position, about 3.5 to 4 meters away. So loudness wise, you should be okay. Just make sure that you're using a subwoofer, and that will remedy a lot of the issues. Now, let's take a look at the data. The spinorama data that I collect is captured from the near field scanner, and I have a clip of this speaker under test. I'll throw it in here and continue to talk. If you're curious about how the near field scanner works, you can click this link that I'll have right here. And this is an interview with Christian Bellman of Klippel. He designed this speaker, or the near field scanner, with the rest of the folks at Klippel. Did a superb job, and he goes into great detail in the interview. The reference plane for this speaker was at the tweeter axis. The speaker was laid on its side. I do have vertical measurements below. The speaker did also come with a grill. This result is not with the grill, but I do have those results as well below. Looking at the response, the one thing that you can see is mostly a neutral speaker, but a couple areas that I think are worth noting. This dip around 2 kilohertz is real. I actually tested this a couple other ways just to make sure, sanity check. Also worth noting is that the shadow flare on the speaker can cause some response anomalies. I proved that out in my R3 testing, but that is not the cause of this in this particular case. The shadow flare is actually pushed all the way in. Now, I gotta say that I didn't really find this area problematic. I did hear some things going on around the 2 to 2.5 kilohertz region. And it could also be that I heard those because of this dip. So when you're talking relative terms, this dip has about a 3 dB to 4 dB difference between this and the nearest surrounding frequencies. So it's possible that the 2 to 2.5 kilohertz region stood out more because of this dip. The good thing is that looking at this data, it appears that you could probably EQ that out. The other thing that I'm going to point out here is this 8.5 kilohertz peak right there. And the rest of the data shows that as you go off axis, that's smoothed out. Thing is, I'm almost certain that's what I was hearing. I used a graphic equalizer, I knocked that down, and yeah, that worked fine. And then when I saw the data, I thought, okay, well, that must have been what I was hearing. Just put two and two together, right? It's worth noting, though, that that stands out in the data, and it stood out to me in my listening test. But when I moved off axis to the side, it diminished a little bit. It wasn't night and day, but I also didn't get 30 degrees to the side. Had I moved 30 degrees to the side to an opposite seat or something like that, like you might have in a home theater setting, then I'm willing to bet that issue would probably have subsided a good deal, if not completely gone away. Another thing that I'll note in the data is this 250 hertz region. Now, in the data, this shows up as a resonance. It showed up in a number of ways, but I got to be honest that when I was listening to my music, I didn't really hear anything that made this stand out. And I'm not saying that you won't notice it. I will say that I typically find lower frequency resonances to be audible more than I think other people might, just because it's something I'm more in tune to maybe than others. And that's not bragging. That's just saying that's based on past experiences, right? But in this case, I didn't really notice an issue here. It is worth noting, though. Now we'll go down here and we'll look at the early reflections. And we see that the early reflections directivity indices actually looks pretty smooth overall. There are some little minor peaks and dips going through. I would believe that most of those are just cabinet diffraction effects and more than likely not terribly audible. If it were perfectly flat and you were able to quickly A/B it, sure, maybe you notice a difference, but I don't know that it's very much worth worrying about. So I'm going to keep moving on. And let's look at the estimated in-room response. Now, this is an area that I think is worth pointing out as well, because earlier I mentioned that the high frequency response, like the R3, the R2c kind of has a bump in that. And generally what you would expect to see is just a downward sloping line because the energy radiated off axis is lower in level than the energy radiated on axis. But when you have narrow directivity response and you have on axis that is bumped up, what you wind up with is a bump in the high frequency area as well. This is completely opposite of what I experienced with the ELAC UBR62. I'll try to throw a link right here. And in that speaker, you can see that the on axis is actually dipped down in the high frequencies, but it's got a very wide response. So they tailored that response to give you a wide response, but not sound bright. Whereas I feel like this speaker, to my own ears, was a little bit excessive in the treble. Now, some people may like this, and some people may consider this kind of a good tonality swing. To my ears, it's not necessarily something I would personally want out of a design, but you can EQ it down if you want to, and there's not really an issue there. The other thing that's worth noting too is this 2.5 kilohertz region, and I believe this is where the sound, the excess energy was coming from in some of the female vocals that I was listening to. Now let's take a look at the horizontal globe plot. And this is just a good way of kind of getting an idea of the dispersion pattern of the speaker. And what I'm looking at here, I'm mainly seeing in the red is bounded by about plus or minus 40 degrees, which is kind of typical for a coaxial design. Referencing back to the ELAC again, that speaker was about plus or minus 60 degrees to the mid-range, but then it narrowed up quickly. Whereas this speaker seemed to have better, what's the word I'm looking here? Directivity control. So control directivity, where it kind of goes along the same angle for the most part, but you do have some interesting areas where that jumps out. Again, this 2.5 kilohertz region has some extra energy. And then this 1.3 area has some extra energy as well. So if you drew a straight line through, 40 degrees, you would see that these over here are kind of going to stand out a little bit. And in my listening, I believe that's what I was hearing as well. So it's something, again, that is worth noting. Vertically, same kind of deal here. With it being a concentric design, it's going to have a little bit more of a narrow spread in the sound radiation. But the good thing about this coaxial design is that it's going to be more uniform. So it generally stays within that plus or minus 40 degree window. Whereas some other speakers I've seen jump all around and do all sorts of craziness. This is a good controlled directivity design. You don't have to be dead on axis with the speaker. And in fact, it may even be better to not be dead on axis with the speaker, as to the reasons I mentioned earlier. So you've got a good window of listening, a good sweet spot window for this speaker. Now, this is the on-axis linearity. We've already talked about all of this, but the F3 is 77 hertz relative to the mean, and the mean is about 85 dB. The impedance I kind of mentioned earlier, and it dips down below about 4 ohm through the base area. Then it kind of rises back up. I found, like I said, when I was running this thing full range, dim the lights. But if you put like an 80 hertz crossover on it or 100 hertz crossover on it, you'll be fine. No big deal. And you should be doing that anyway. Now, the step response. I'm not going to get too deep into this because there's a lot of things that you can kind of pick apart on this. But I really do want to note a couple things. We've got the tweeter impulse, so the initial impulse of the tweeter, and then wired out of polarity with the mid-range going down and then going up to the mid-woofer. And right here, you should see kind of a more curved peaking going on, but instead you've got this dip here. So that indicates that there is something that's not quite clean in this area. And if you do the math, the difference between about 2 and about 3, that puts you at around 1 kilohertz or so. So let's jump back up to the 1K region and see if there's anything kind of funky going on there that might be interesting to look at. So I'm going to go back and look at this. And what I'm seeing here in the horizontal spread is, remember earlier I mentioned the near field, remember earlier how I mentioned the shallow slopes being used? Well, you can see that is showing up here. And the interesting thing to me is that where the mid-range is coming into play, you start to get more of a trough going on right here, and the mid-range and the 1 kilohertz area is starting to stack up. If I'm being 100% honest, I'm not sure if the step response issue is really an issue at that point, or if it just happens to line up with this and maybe it's not really telling, but I find that interesting. The other thing that I want to note about the step response, and this does show up, is this guy right here. And the difference between 2 milliseconds, the initial sound, and the 6 millisecond portion right here is 4 milliseconds. So that's about 250 hertz. Well, remember I said you had some resonance going on in that region. And sure enough, yeah, you see it right here in the estimated interim response. And we sure as day see it right here in the spinorama data. Now, again, how audible that's going to be, I don't know. I've already mentioned it, but I find that interesting and I think it's worth noting because it's kind of cool when you get to see stuff like that and you're able to link them back together. Now, what we've got here is the near field response. Now, the way I tested this was I used the terminals on the back and I just unlinked them. So I tested the coaxial by itself and then the mid-woofers by themselves. And you can see that the shallow slope is really kind of prominent here or more observable in this response. And this explains the dip that you see in the off-axis horizontal response. Harmonic distortion is relatively low at 86 dB, and then we go to 96 dB. And through the mid-range, it's pretty low. When you get to the lower frequencies, then you start getting higher distortion. That's really no surprise. Now, the dynamic range testing that I do, this is really where it shows you kind of the limits of the speaker. And in this case, we can see that the 76 dB versus 102 dB in purple. Yeah, there's a pretty significant swing through here and some odd stuff going on. So this speaker is becoming pretty nonlinear in this area, I would say. It's not hugely significant, certainly seen worse. But I think what this is telling you is, hey, this speaker's starting to tip its hat toward, I'm running out of steam. I probably don't need to be pushed too much further beyond this. 102 dB for this single speaker in a room. If you're a few meters away, you're probably looking at more of the 80 dB region. So if you were to use a subwoofer, again, as I highly suggest, you're going to be able to take some of the load off this, and this area won't be as problematic. And depending on what's causing this, it may not be as problematic as well, but it's worth noting. Now, I measured the speaker with the grill on because I was personally interested to see what the result is. So let's go down here. And through the mid-range area, pretty much the same thing. But when you get above 1 kilohertz, that's when I start seeing things that I recall being different. And then certainly when you get above, the 8 kilohertz region to 10 kilohertz, I mean, you've got some really odd stuff going on. What this is really telling you is don't use the grill unless you have to. Now, what happens when you stand the speaker upright? What does the spin data look like? Well, for this speaker, it's pretty much the exact same. Matter of fact, if I overlaid this set of data on top of the horizontal data, it's pretty much the exact same. And the only area that you really get a difference is the early reflections. And I find that actually the horizontal early reflections looks better. That's going to do it for this review. If you do want to buy this speaker, I'm going to drop an affiliate link below, and that will help me with a small commission at no additional cost to you. But obviously, you don't have to do that. I'm just letting you know if you want to help support the channel that way. Alternatively, I have a Patreon that I just started, which took me a little bit of motivation to do, but I finally decided to give it a shot. And if you want to help contribute or support me that way, that would be great. I would certainly appreciate it. And with that said, I'm going to end this thing. I hope you learned something, and we'll talk to you next time. Peace.